The Enfield Poltergeist, one of the most famous paranormal cases in modern history. A story that captivated the world in the late 1970s, captivated me as a child. The case spawned books, documentaries, and even Hollywood adaptations. But what really happened inside that modest council house in North London? Today, I delve deep into the story, trying to separate fact and fiction, and exposing the inconsistencies that will continue to cast doubt over this infamous case. Weirdos, balls and ghouls, how are we all doing? The Enfield Poltergeist, a case that has enthralled me since I was very young. So today, we're going to be breaking down the Enfield Poltergeist. Truths, myths, fact, fiction, and everything in between. And before we get fully into it, I just want you to understand something, that I actually believe there was something to the Enfield Poltergeist. I think it just got a little bit out of hand once the press became involved and the kids were gifted things and, you know, almost like they were paid to perform by certain people that were involved in this case. This story begins in August 1977, when single mother Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children started to report strange occurrences in their home. Furniture moving on its own, knocking sounds echoing throughout the home, and then eventually 2 of the daughters, Janet and Margaret, claiming to be the target of a violent poltergeist. The media quickly picked up on the story, and the family then found themselves at the centre of a paranormal media frenzy. But when we take a deeper look, even from the very beginning, signs were there that not all was as it seemed. Let's start with one of the initial witnesses, which is not a paranormal investigator. It is a police officer, and this police officer statement is why I initially bought this hook, line and sinker. Police Constable Caroline Heaps claimed that she saw a chair move across the floor without any human intervention. And like for me, this moment is cited as something that is strong evidence for the fact that there was something paranormal at this house.
It came off the floor, or nearly a ½ inch, I should say, and I saw it slide off to the right, about 3.5 to 4 feet before it came to rest. I checked to see whether or not it could possibly have slid along the floor. I placed a marble on the floor to see whether or not the marble would go in the same direction as the chair did, and it didn't roll at all. I checked for wires under the cushion of the chair, and I could find no explanation at all. But
when we look a little closer, there are some problems that emerge. The chair in question only moved a short distance, and it was in a room full of people, so could somebody have accidentally knocked the chair or dragged the chair? It's not impossible to think that somebody could have just knocked the chair without the police officer seeing. And we also have to take into account this could have been a prank. Furthermore, Heap's statement was further challenged by other work colleagues, and they were more skeptical about what they saw. And then there's the issue of witness testimony itself. You see, something that I am having to learn as I fall deeper and deeper into this paranormal rabbit hole on YouTube is that psychology shows us that memories are not infallible. I mean, for example, I distinctly remember an event with a Ouija board when I was much younger. And having spoke to 4 people that were there at the time, we all remember it different. Now, are we all lying? Or are we all misremembering? I would hazard a guess that we are all misremembering. And maybe there's a case of that. You see, witnesses to extraordinary events have their recollections sort of distorted by stress or fear, media influence, the passage of time. This could be the thing that happened at the Enfield case with this police officer. Were people seeing what they expected to see because of the reports, or was it what they wanted to see? The media, well, they played a huge role in the Enfield Poltergeist story. As soon as the news broke, journalists and photographers all flocked to the house, eager to capture proof of the paranormal. And the family, who were overwhelmed and seeking help, they found themselves in the middle of a media circus as well as a potential haunting. But this attention may have inadvertently sort of influenced the events themselves. If we're to take this case seriously, then we have to consider the possibility that the media presence could have put more pressure on the Hodgson children, particularly Janet, because she was the focal point, not just of the activity, but of the press. With her constantly having cameras and microphones pointed at her, is it possible that she felt compelled to keep this story going? Consciously or even subconsciously? Was she worried about letting her parents down, letting her siblings down? Did she enjoy the infamy? And let's not forget that there is evidence some of these events were in part staged. One of the most famous incidents involved Janet being recorded while she was speaking in a gruff male voice.
The same question as I asked earlier. How many voices are there?
600.
600 the voices.
I know the joke.
How many really are there, Margaret?
I think so far we've had 10
Three.
sensible voices, but the rest of the names are absolute rubbish.
What about the voices? When did the voices start?
December the 12th,
December the 12th.
yes.
And how did they start?
Well, one night Mr. Grove was talking about it about 8:30. He said, all we need now is the voices to talk.
Supposedly the voice of deceased previous owner of the house, Bill Wilkins. This was presented as irrefutable evidence of a possession, but experts noted that while Janet's voice did change, it wasn't beyond the capability of a young girl being able to produce those sounds. Basically, she could have been performing, influenced by the attention and the expectations surrounding her and the haunted home. Now, there were paranormal investigators brought into this case, and for the most part we're going to be skipping Ed and Lorraine Warren, because if you have The Conjuring 2 in your head, none of that happened. There's nothing to do with Valak, they didn't stay over very long. In fact, they had very little to do with the case. The main investigators were Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair. Both were members of the Society for Psychical Research. Both men were committed believers into the paranormal, and their investigations were the backbone of this case. But their motives and their methods have both come under scrutiny. For example, Maurice Gross had a personal stake in the case. You see, he had recently lost his own daughter in a tragic accident, and a lot of people are more inclined to believe that the grief made Maurice want to believe in this paranormal event as a way of coping with his own loss. Basically, his desire to find proof of the afterlife could have influenced his interpretation of the Enfield haunting. Guy Lyon Playfair, an experienced paranormal researcher, was also deeply invested into this case. He even wrote a book on it, This House is Haunted, and that book is one of the primary sources on the Enfield Poltergeist. But it's important, and we have to remember that Playfair was writing from a perspective of belief. We could argue that both of these men were prone to confirmation bias. Were they interpreting the evidence in a way that supported their already existing beliefs about the paranormal? Look at the evidence that they collected. Much of it was just witness testimony, which, as we've discussed, is inherently unreliable. And this is something that, in conversations with Justin from the Paranormal Monkey podcast, Kev Kerr, these things have stirred up within even myself and my own investigations, confirmation bias, because I'm a believer. And then we look at physical evidence, the recordings of the strange sounds and moving objects. It's also questionable. Many of the phenomena could be easily faked or have natural explanations. For instance, the levitation photographs of Janet, they've been widely criticised for showing nothing more than a young girl jumping off her bed. Experts have looked into it. You can see that she's propelled herself as to being pulled. And then, of course, we can't ignore the infamous incident where Janet was caught bending spoons and then attempting to hide her actions from the investigators. Playfair himself admitted in his book that the children were caught faking some of the activity, yet he maintained that the case was genuine overall. But then how do we separate the truth from the fiction? If some of it was staged or faked, then maybe all of it could have been. Beyond the paranormal explanations, there are psychological and social factors that we have to consider. Without being rude, the Hodgson family were living in quite difficult circumstances. Peggy being a single mum, and being a single mum back in the 70s was a lot different to what it is now. She was raising 4 children in quite a cramped, at the time, run-down house. The children, particularly Janet, were under a great deal of stress. And psychologists have pointed out that poltergeist cases can often occur with adolescents going through emotional turmoil. And let's not forget that Janet was around the age of puberty where most poltergeist cases seem to come from. Could Janet have been going through some sort of emotional turmoil after not having her dad around and then having to deal with puberty and school and being from a poor home and a poor family? And that leads to the question, could the poltergeist have been a manifestation of the family's psychological distress as opposed to the supernatural? We also have to look at the power of suggestion. Times were a lot different in the 1970s. Belief in the paranormal was far more widespread than what it is now, and stories of hauntings and poltergeists were far more common in the media. And this sort of culture could have influenced the Hodgsons' perception of the events in the home. For example, if somebody tells you your house is haunted, suddenly every bang, every creak, every thud, every door that opens in a draft, any unexplained corner of the eye phenomena could be interpreted as evidence of the supernatural. And again, when we look at the family dynamics, Janet was 11 years old and was at the centre of all of this poltergeist activity. And it wouldn't be wrong to say that most of the children involved in poltergeist cases are quite often seeking attention, either consciously or subconsciously. And the Enfield case bears some similarities to other cases where children were later found to have fabricated the events. Many skeptics have examined the Enfield case, offering alternative explanations for the events. And while believers could argue that the sheer volume of phenomena points to something supernatural, skeptic could counter that most, if not all, of the incidents could be explained by a natural or psychological cause. Pranks and hoaxes are often part of poltergeist cases, and in the Enfield haunting, the Hodgson children admitted to faking some of the activity, though they claimed that not all of it was staged. This admission alone does cast doubt on the entire case. If they were willing to fake some events, then how can we trust any of it was real? I myself look at paranormal channels, and if I see one evidence of something being faked, I will dismiss everything from that channel. And by rights, I should completely dismiss the Enfield case. You could also argue that once the seed of a prank planted, it can grow into something else entirely, something much larger, especially under the scrutiny of the media and eager paranormal investigators, and then not wanting to be caught in the lie. And again, we need to look at misinterpretation. For example, the knocking sounds heard throughout the house. Could they have been caused as really mundane things like floorboards expanding or settling, the wind or pipes contracting? This house was quite old back then and not maintained very well. And these types of noises, they're not uncommon in any house. But when you're looking through the lens of a poltergeist narrative, every single noise that you hear can have a much more sinister meaning. How many people do we see go to 30 East Drive and every single tap, thud or bang is something otherworldly? And then when somebody skeptical goes there, they call out, hey, that's next door. That's next door going up the stairs. That's next door closing the door. Yet you see other channels call it out as the paranormal. And some psychologists have offered another perspective. For example, Janet's vocalizations and physical movements, they could be explained by borderline personality disorder, or even a simpler psychological response to the extreme stress that she was under. These conditions can cause people to act out in ways that seem foreign or even supernatural. In high-stress situations, your own mind can create elaborate coping mechanisms, and that could go some way in explaining Janet's strange behaviour. Even more so, the influence of suggestion and expectation, known as the expectancy effect, that could have played a major role. The more Janet and her family are told they're dealing with a poltergeist, the more they come to believe it, consciously or unconsciously sort of conforming their experiences to fit a narrative. But the Enfield Poltergeist story just didn't end when the activity subsided in 1979. In the years since, this case has been endlessly analysed. It's been debated, it's been adapted into books, into TV shows, into movies. But what is the true legacy of the Enfield Poltergeist? Is it a cautionary tale about the dangers of belief? Or is it a genuine mystery that challenges our understanding of reality? You see, the Enfield case had a profound impact on popular culture. It inspired films like The Conjuring 2 and numerous documentaries. And these adaptations, they often overblow and amplify the most dramatic and frightening elements of the story, which then further blur the lines between fact and fiction. And the end result being a legend that has taken on a life of its own, something far removed from the actual events of 1977. But the sensationalism of these adaptations has also perpetrated inconsistencies and the dubious aspects of the case, creating a narrative that is more about entertainment than the truth. And these stories, they captivate audiences. It captivates me. The movies are great, but they distort the reality of what happened at Enfield. The general public in this day and age will look at things like Ed Marine Warren's involvement and Valak, and then it ends up leaving us with more questions than answers and leaving people like me far more skeptical of the real events. And the skeptics have never remained silent about the case. Over the years, skeptics have been pointing out the flaws and the contradictions in the Enfield story, from unreliable witness testimonies to the possibility of hoaxes. And a skeptical perspective kind of reminds us to question what we see and what we hear, especially when extraordinary things are presented as ordinary. In the end, the Enfield Poltergeist might be best understood as a complex interplay of psychological and cultural factors, and it remains one of the most famous cases of its kind. And it also serves as a reminder of how easily belief clouds our judgment, and how difficult it can be to discern the truth when the paranormal is involved. So can we learn anything from the Enfield Poltergeist? I personally think the most important lesson that we could learn would be the need for critical thinking and skepticism, especially when faced with such extraordinary claims. Whilst the story of the Enfield Poltergeist is captivating and enthralling, and at times just genuinely unsettling, it's also riddled with inconsistencies and unanswered questions. And by looking at these things with a more critical eye, we can better understand not only this case, but also the nature of belief and the human mind. And finally, this video is not meant to just poo-poo the whole thing away. It's designed to engage you guys at home and sort of provoke a bit of thought into what really happened at the Enfield Poltergeist. Look at it from multiple angles and encourage your own critical thinking about what you believe to be true. And please do share your thoughts in the comment section down below. Much love to you all. Beardo out.